Hello everyone, I'm Thomas at Art and Lit Matters. It amazes me the way that so many of Shakespeare's 154 sonnets carve out little worlds in and of themselves. We are going to look at one today that opens up not only a world but almost a universe of meaning, and I mean Sonnet 129. It goes, "The expense of spirit in a waste of shame is lust in action, and till action, lust is perjured, murderous, bloody, full of blame, savage, rude, extreme, cruel, not to trust, enjoyed no sooner, but despised straight, past reason hunted, and no sooner had, past reason hated, as a swallowed bait on purpose laid to take the maker mad. Mad in pursuit, and in possession so, had, having, and in quest to have extreme. A bliss in proof, and proved a very woe. Before, a joy proposed, behind, a dream. All this the world knows well, and yet none knows well to shun the heaven that leads men to this hell." And really, lust as perjured, murderous, bloody, full of blame, savage, rude, extreme, cruel, if we take Shakespeare at his word, and I think we always have to, doesn't have much to do with the other sonnets, which, however extreme the states of mind they express, they're always about some form of human connectedness. But this is an unmaking of the human life world and one's immersion in the human life world. It is an unmaking of one's sense of human compassion and empathy. It's like Lady Macbeth saying, "Come to my woman's breasts and take my milk for gall, you murthering ministers. I have given suck and know how tender 'tis to nurse the babe that milks me. I would, while it were smiling in my face, have plucked my nipple from its boneless gums and dashed the brains out." And how can she say such a thing? Because Lady Macbeth has spent a lot of energy on unmaking her own capacity for human connection and care in the world. "Come, you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts, unsex me here and fill me from the toe to the crown top full of direst cruelty. Make thick my blood and stop up the access and passage to remorse, that no compunctious visitings of nature step between the effect and it," is a shocking passage. Forget the milk of human kindness. I'd rather have the gall of human malignancy and indifference to everybody else if it lets me accomplish my aims. And then the psychological unmaking of "make thick my blood and stop up the access and passage to remorse, that no compunctious visitings of nature step between the effect and it." We are seeing here the self-fashioning, self-making of a terribly sociopathic creature, indifferent to the world, without empathy, fiercely self-absorbed and narcissistic, without a care in the world except accomplishing her and her husband's selfish and destructive aims. And it's very similar to the dark unmaking of the poem, where what is actually embraced is destructive lust that doesn't care a bit about the object of the lust. Of course, it's bloody, murderous, perjured, full of blame, savage, rude, extreme, cruel. Ask yourself, what kind of psychological reality are we really in this poem of swallowed bait and lust described as bloody and murderous, and a woman's midsection described as a waste of shame? And really, we're more in the universe of the immense destructiveness of Iago, who takes such delight in creating mayhem and human misery, or of the Macbeths, who spend so much energy deliberately unmaking their capacity for human empathy and human kindness. Like every other Shakespeare sonnet, this one tells several stories simultaneously, and the most obvious one is that it's the shortest and most explicit retelling of that familiar narrative of being obsessed with an object of lust, attaining that object, and then rejecting it, having, and in quest to have extreme, a bliss in proof, and proved a very woe. And indeed, one of the remarkable things about this sonnet is the entire thing sort of hangs on this balancing fulcrum of before and during and after orgasm, and the very human description of a pre-coital having, and in quest to have extreme fits all the other erotically tinged sonnets where desire can just be like fire and flood simultaneously. But this one hinges so explicitly on the very act of orgasm, and that is described in such a kind of clear anatomical sense and without any regard at all for the object of the speaker's lust. And in fact, when we look at the very first line, the expense of spirit in a waste of shame, we have to remember that spirit was an Elizabethan term for semen. And so you have this incredibly vivid, explicit image of ejaculation in the midriff of a woman. How is it described? The waste, the anatomical waste of shame. But of course, it carries with it the homonym of waste as something which is rubbish or awful or cast out or without value. So from the very first line, we are in this universe of devaluing the object of one's lust. And Sonnet 129, in its absolute indifference to the object of one's desire, is closer to the world of true crime and psychopathic total indifference to one's victims. Shakespeare goes farther than any other artist in exploring the inner psychology of human evil. In a character like Iago, we watch this relentless, loving, tender devotion to achieving a world of destruction and mayhem and misery in those around him. He is an artist of mayhem with zero real regard for the world. It's the absolute psychopath on steroids because his love of destructiveness is so vast. And really, in the way that both in Richard III and more so in the Macbeths and in Iago, we are privy to the inward psychology of human evil, Shakespeare is ahead of the jump. When it comes to human evil, Shakespeare does something quite remarkable, which we still can learn from. It's not just like he's portraying his evil characters like Iago or Iachimo from the outside through the vehicle of interior monologue. We are privy not just to their thoughts, but their inward psychology. I sometimes think the single most defining characteristic of Shakespeare's work that sets it apart from the work of all other writers is the extraordinary use he makes of the soliloquy. In ordinary dialogue, we see characters interacting with each other, but in the soliloquy, we hear characters essentially in dialogue with themselves. And within that dialogue, the way Shakespeare opens up an internal world of interior space, a psychologized space, and a space that is pondering and changing and growing and reacting within, is absolutely extraordinary. We see thoughts and part of being actually coming into birth. And when the soliloquy is by one of Shakespeare's villains, the effect is often riveting. In her soliloquy, we overhear the act of Lady Macbeth actively unmaking her own capacity for human feeling, for human empathy, for compassion. It begins with her utter destruction of her maternal instincts. Take my milk for gall, you murthering ministers. None of this silliness about the milk of human kindness. There's a task to be done, and I'm going to accomplish it with ruthless efficiency. How about the natural sense of guilt? Stop up the access and passage to remorse, that no compunctious visitings of nature step between the effect and it. We are watching the process of her trying to unmake her capacity for maternal feelings, for compassion in the world, and for suffering any kind of internal guilt about doing evil deeds. It is an amazing performance, and it is one that definitely bears on Sonnet 129, where the only thing that exists, we are in a zero land except for lust, except for the desire to accomplish the aim of lust. And the things which normally keep us concerned about the welfare of others is simply blotted out. And what we see in Lady Macbeth, or a character like Richard III, who is determined to be a villain because he cannot be a lover, not just the decision to do evil, but this active extirpation of anything which would be an impediment of that, and lusty relish of being a creator of mayhem, and absolute blotting out of empathy and all regard for the welfare of other human beings, puts Sonnet 129 directly in kind of harmony with the interior mindscape of Richard III or the Macbeths. I very much like Shakespeare's sonnets, and most of them are about the desire for human intimacy and the significant connection with another human being. So I don't want to leave with the one poem which is really about human psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder, or about the unmaking or destruction of empathy, or about a world where true care for another human being simply does not exist. So here's a very different sonnet, perhaps to balance or offset that one. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy, contented least. Yet, in these thoughts, myself almost despising, haply I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day, arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. For thy sweet love, remembered, such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings. All right, thank you for watching.